Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Remus. On behalf of America's Job Exchange, thank you for joining us today for Looking to the Past for Your Future Action Plan. Before we get started, I have a few notes. Please use the chat feature to submit questions at any time during our broadcast. We have allowed time at the end of today's event to answer your questions, and we'll get to as many as we are able. If we don't get to your question today, you will receive an answer via email. Please allow a few days for that response given the holidays. Thank you. And since we do get this question a lot, we will be sending a copy of the slides presented today and a link to the recording to you after the broadcast. Once again, allow a couple of days for that delivery. Thanks. Finally, after this event, a link to a short survey will pop up. If you can take a minute to let us know what you thought of today's presentation, we would greatly appreciate it. And now I'd like to welcome today's fantastic speaker, Matt Nussbaum, Director of Biddle Consulting Group's BCG Institute for Workforce Development, or BCGi. Matt will tell you a little bit about himself, but I'll start by saying he is one of the nation's leading authorities on workplace affirmative action. He works with federal contractor employers regarding the non-discrimination and affirmative action requirements enforced by the OFCCP. Additionally, Matt also regularly consults on other related labor and employment law requirements. We are thrilled to have him here. Matt, thanks so much for presenting today. I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to our presentation, Looking to the Past for Your Future Action Plan. See what we did there? A little back to the future thing for you? All right. Our purpose today is to look at how we can develop and implement more meaningful and therefore hopefully more compliant action plans by using information that we already have at our disposal or should have at our disposal. We're going to try to break out of the mold of the same old that the OFCCP is frankly tired of seeing and develop action plans that might actually have a chance at success. So let's jump right in. But before we go too far, you might be asking yourself, who the heck is this guy? And as Lauren mentioned, my name is Matt Nussbaum, but my name is a little less important than what it is that I do for a living. I'm the director of BCGi, and my job boils down to bringing you information about equal employment opportunity and affirmative action that you can actually understand and, most importantly, you can actually use. That's it. That's pretty much what I do. That's my job description. Now, I am an attorney, but I'm going to ask you to not hold that against me. I practiced in New York and Washington, D.C. for 10 years, most of that in the affirmative action arena. And I've worked for some of the largest and, if I may say so, most prestigious law firms in the world. I've developed thousands of affirmative action plans for my clients and successfully defended hundreds of those. And I'm now a recovering attorney. So I'm going to try not to sound too lawyery. I'm also a former data analyst and computer programmer. My specialty was database design, implementation, and management. So I'm familiar with many of the challenges that you face getting the data and information you need for affirmative action purposes, and importantly, making sure that data is accurate. So I feel your pain, is what I'm saying. I also used to manage the plumbing department of an Ace Hardware, and I'm proud to say that to this day, I've still never met a toilet that I couldn't fix. So if you have questions about affirmative action obligations, data mining, or plumbing, you've come to the right place. But back to this whole BCGi thing. The full name is the BCG Institute for Workforce Development, and that's the training and education arm of the Biddle Consulting Group. Biddle has been preparing and defending AAPs, among many other things, for nearly 50 years. So those are my bona fides. Let's talk briefly about who you are. You are the person tasked with getting stuff done, right? Typically, organizations resist having to think about compliance issues. They just want them taken care of. And you're the person largely tasked with keeping compliance issues off other people's radar, which is at odds with the purposes of the regulations, isn't it? The point of affirmative action is to bring EEO to the forefront of people's minds and to integrate EEO principles into daily operations. But no one wants to think about this stuff. No one wants to deal with this stuff. Thus, our challenge. You're also the person who gets no credit for for all of the problems your organization avoids through all of your hard work. It's like trying to prove a negative. There's no good way to quantify how much your efforts save the company in terms of time and money and productivity. Sure, you can download some OFCCP settlement documents with other organizations and say, see, that could be us, but it isn't because I'm awesome. But that only gets you so far. The best way, which is to say the worst way of proving your worth, is when things actually go sideways in an audit and the company gets slapped with some money violations. That can demonstrate to the organization real quick what happens when you don't give compliance the tools and resources they need to be effective. Unfortunately, that means being in the hot seat, which no one likes. So you're stuck scrapping for budget dollars, fighting for personnel, and wrestling for priority. The point is, I get it, which is why I'm not trying to make your work life more difficult than it already is. That's not the point of this exercise. But there's this natural tension for an organization to commit as little as possible to stay quote unquote compliant, which runs directly counter to you being able to implement truly effective affirmative action efforts and, I don't know, God forbid, actually help someone. Because we want our work to have meaning, don't we? We want, no one wants their job to be check the box compliance. We want to feel that our efforts actually made the playing field a little more even, made our workplace one in which people can succeed on their merits, made our workplace one in which people want to work. So we try to balance, and that's what we're going to try to do today. Keeping the playing field even is really kind of the crux of it. Title VII requires us to promise that the organization will not discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, right? That familiar laundry list. Affirmative action is all the things we do to keep that promise. And a lot of people misunderstand that, right? Affirmative action isn't about giving one group an advantage to the disadvantage of another. It's about making sure no one is disadvantaged because of the way that they were born. It's literally our job to look around our organization with a critical eye and look for things that seem a bit off. Where they do, we then look for artificial barriers. That's just a regulatory way of saying we ask if the reason things look a bit off is the company's fault. We don't seem to have many female truck drivers. Is that because the company is doing something to shut the door on qualified female drivers? Or is it something else, something outside the organization's control? That's the beating heart of affirmative action, by the way. And the primary way that we look for things that seem off starts with the yearbook. Every year, we take class photos, don't we? We download out of our HRMS a list of all employees as of a certain date, the start of our AAP cycle, and we call it a snapshot. That snapshot, like a class picture, shows us what our workforce looks like. And like class photos, we split up the snapshot by AAP location and AAP job group so we know who is in what homeroom, right? And we look at those class pictures and we see the demographics of our actual workforce, who we are. We compare that to what we think our workforce could look like based on the demographics of the people who could work for us. Now, I said could, not should, and that's an important distinction. Whether or not our workforce should look different than it does today has yet to be determined. But where the demographic differences are significant enough, we plant a survey marker there that says, dig here, look closer. There might be something amiss here. In other words, are the differences we're seeing enough to indicate that there might be an artificial barrier here to EEO? Do we need to make sure that the difference in demographics that we're seeing is not the result of any company action or inaction? If so, we're expected to actually do something about it, tear down the barrier, make the playing field more even. Okay, so we've compared the class picture to the relevant labor force. This presentation isn't about defining that labor force, but we know it's the people in our our reasonable recruiting areas, right, that are qualified to do the jobs that we need done. And we know that data probably comes from the US Census, specifically a 5-year survey completed 9 years ago that only has about 488 active job codes to represent all of the different jobs in the country. That's to say that our availability estimates are just that. They're estimates, and not likely very good ones to boot. But it's what we've got, and when we compare it to the class picture, we see significant differences in demographics. Specifically, our incumbency is, quote, less than would reasonably be expected given availability. That's a nice way of saying there could be discrimination going on here. So we investigate that too, right? We run impact ratio analyses comparing the selection rates of different groups based on sex and race ethnicity to try to uncover any discriminatory effect or effects in our hiring processes. And if we find it, we're supposed to fix that. So if you have an AAP job group with a placement goal for women and your hiring IRAs for that job group are showing potential adverse impact against women, you'll want to address the potential discrimination aspect first. Your action plan does not require an admission of guilt. So you'll probably say something to the effect of, through an extensive investigation of the company's hiring policies and practices, we concluded that no discrimination occurred. Nonetheless, the company has identified specific hiring managers who could benefit from additional EEO training, or something along those lines. But let's assume, for the sake of this conversation, your IRAs aren't an issue, because that's frankly a whole other presentation in and of itself. Nope, this is just the run-of-the-mill situation where we have set placement goals for women or people of color, and the regulations say we have to come up with an action plan to address that. So what do? Well, most people copy and paste some generic language committing the company to engaging in additional targeted outreach and recruiting for the affected groups. Then we cross our fingers and we hope that our talent acquisition professionals actually follow the plan, such as it is, and they come up themselves with some fresh, new, relevant outreach partners and actually use them and document those efforts for us so that when we lose the lottery and the OFCCP pays us a visit, we have something to show them. Then what happens? Well, in an audit, the OFCCP sees your goals. They make you do a goal attainment report, and where the goals weren't met, they ask for document evidence of your good faith efforts. Typically, that's when people discover that they don't have much to show, and the OFCCP cites them for insufficient outreach. Just a side note, there is no explicit regulatory basis for a violation called insufficient outreach. What the OFCCP really means is insufficient effort. They just know that the most common effort in question is outreach, so they're being a little colloquial, but we know what they mean. All right. So what does OFCCP want? Well, what they don't want is to see that generic boilerplate language. They can spot it a mile away, and they see it day in and day out. And yes, they are familiar with all of the AAP templates out there. So they know as soon as they get your AAP, which vendor you use. What they want, what the OFCCP is looking for, is specifics. They want to see efforts that are tailored to the particular job groups in the AAP, or the particular jobs, excuse me, in the AAP job group with a placement goal. What's going to move the needle for these specific positions? Oh, you have your career page scraped and your job postings blasted out to every diversity site under the sun. That's great. That actually is great. But what OFCCP is going to follow up and ask is, what are you doing about these specific jobs where we're seeing this specific difference in demographics? And they're looking for dynamic efforts that change from year to year in response to past results. We had a goal, we tried this thing, the goal persists and we didn't meet it, so we try this other thing. This thing worked, so we're keeping it, but this thing didn't, so we're doing something different. They want to see engagement. That's the name of the game. Remember, there's no violation for having placement goals, and there's no violation for not meeting those goals. The violation is for not trying hard enough. And you have to be able to show the OFCCP that you are trying in good faith. That means showing your work. Like my teacher, Mrs. Smith, from my 5th grade math class, was always haranguing us, show your work. And that's a lot easier to do when you document the process and are prepared to have a conversation. Better yet, when your action plan is a conversation about what the company is doing and why. Even if you're not hitting your goals, you're taking credit for the overall effort, right? Let me back up. Let's talk quickly about what I call year-over-year goals, right? Those are the ones that persist in one form or another from AAP to AAP, right? We had a female placement rate goal for engineers in 2015, and again in 2016, and again in 2017, 18, and 19. It's actually pretty common to have recurring year-over-year goals, so don't panic. And yes, it's common not to hit all of your goals every year. In fact, hitting all of your goals is a little suspicious, isn't it? It kind of begs the question, how are you doing that without violating Title VII, right? Without actually setting quotas or something like that. Hint, if you're hitting all of your goals magically every year, you probably are violating Title VII. So I think it's important to pull forward your prior year action plans. Sure, in an audit, you can go digging through your past AAPs and your past action plans, but frankly, that's a pain in the neck. And how far back do you keep your plans anyway? 2 years? Some of these goals have been on the books for much longer than that. So where does all that history go? It should be in your current action plan. Ideally, my action plan for the female engineer placement goal is going to address when that goal first popped up, what we've done in the past to address it, what's worked, what hasn't, and what we're doing now. In other words, how did we get here, right? I think that's fairly important for the action plan to lay out. Even if you're not hitting your goals, you're taking credit for the overall effort, right? You're building a narrative that demonstrates a strong compliance posture. Your failures, for lack of a better term, are not hidden. They're part of the conversation, as they should be. There's no violation for ineffective outreach. OFCCP confuses people on that point a little, I think, because they require us to evaluate the effectiveness of our outreach efforts, don't they? At least for our disability and veteran plans. It isn't technically required for your female and people of color plan, but I think it's a practical requirement. Yet you're ultimately not judged on the extent to which your efforts were effective. The question is whether or not they were sufficient. And yes, they can be both ineffective and sufficient, which kind of brings us to the concept of the no plan action plan. If you can demonstrate that all reasonable efforts have been taken and taken in good faith, you really tried, then it becomes hard to argue that the differences in demographics we're seeing are the company's fault, doesn't it? Yes, I did say no plan, actually. It might very well be that the demographic data is flawed, as we know that census data is. There could be any number of reasons why the demographics that we're seeing and the differences that we're seeing are what they are. But when we lay out all the things the company has done to make sure that those differences in demographics isn't anything the company is doing, at a certain point, your action plan may be to effectively do nothing different, nothing new, because you're already making all reasonable effort already. And yes, I have presented no plan action plans to the OFCCP before, and yes, they have survived scrutiny, but only where you can show receipts. Okay, there we go. Regardless, the OFCCP is looking through a cause and effect lens, right? They expect to see the organization react in some way to having set a placement goal. The tried and true outreach response is one reaction you can have. But once all reasonable outreach and recruiting resources have been utilized, is there more you can do? Well, maybe. Actually, there are probably lots of things that I would recommend doing before jumping to the no plan plan. But if everything is buttoned down, we're engaged with all the partners that we can find. We've invited them to learn more about our organizations. We have personal interactions with them. We've trained our people and put them through refresher training. We monitor. We've done all we can do, and here we are still. You've got to be able to show those receipts. And that's much easier to do when your action plans build on one another and past plans go into the narrative of the new plan. Are there other situations in which a no plan action plan might be appropriate? Yes, I can think of one big one, actually. Be on the lookout for female placement rate goals for jobs that have historically been viewed as women's work, right? An example that pops to mind from my own experience is nursing. I had a client that was a hospital contractor, and at one of their facilities under audit, the nursing group, or one of them, was comprised of about 87% women. But the census data showed female availability at 96%. That difference was enough to require setting a goal, so they set a placement goal as required. Then their plan was to do absolutely nothing about it. What the action plan laid out was that nursing is traditionally a female-dominated field. Society in general has steered women into the nursing profession, often at the expense of the medical profession, right? Women are nurses, men are doctors. The incumbency percentage demonstrates that women are having no trouble being hired into this organization's nursing positions, and the goal, the availability percentage, is almost 100%. Sorry, but this organization will not contribute further to steering women into nursing, nor is it going to close the door on men who enter the profession. So yes, there are other situations in which a no plan action plan is appropriate, but you've got to be able to have that conversation. You've got to be able to lay it out to OFCCP and explain why we've identified a potential problem area, but determined why it's not actually a problem, or why it's not necessarily the company's problem. Right, because the OFCCP's regulations are fairly clear. Even if you intend to develop a no plan action plan, you still have to set the goal if incumbency is less than would reasonably be expected given availability. I love that phrase out of the regulations, by the way. But after the goal is set, right, that's where we determine what, if anything, should be done about the fact that we had to set a goal. The identification of problem areas is actually a separate section of the OFCCP's regulations. Setting a placement goal is not the same thing as identifying a problem area. And you might need to remind the compliance officer in an audit of that from time to time, but it is absolutely true. A goal is not necessarily a problem. It just means that there's a difference in demographics here that looks off, right? So you have to set a goal, and the regulations say for every goal, there must be a plan to address it. So it's the action plan where you make your argument about the proper way to address that goal. The action plan is everything. So let's build a better plan. Assuming we're not in a situation where a no plan action plan is going to cut it, we can do better than company will engage in additional outreach and recruiting efforts targeting qualified female or POC candidates. Yes, I think we can do better than that. More importantly, the OFCCP thinks we can do better than that. The trick is looking at the data and information you already have, all the stuff that you're required to do in putting together an AAP, and deciphering the story that's telling, right? All numbers tell a story. They show trends. They put things in stark black and white. So what are our numbers telling us? Are they telling us to abandon past efforts altogether? Are they telling us that past efforts might just need a little more baking time? Are they telling us that outreach isn't where we should be focusing? Let's see. let's look for progress. That's, I think, really key. If we're seeing progress, we can infer that our efforts are effective, which is a good thing. So how do we do that? Well, if you've ever endured an OFCCP audit, you've already done it. And I hope it's a part of your annual AAP preparation process. And I really hope you actually revisit it again during the AAP, or usually at about mid-year. And what I'm talking about is doing a goal attainment or a goal progress report, right? You take the total number of hires and promotions into the AAP job group over the previous year, and the total number of those that were female or people of color, depending on the goal that we're talking about. We divide the latter by the former to get the female or people of color placement rate percentage, and we compare the placement percentage to our availability percentage, which is the goal. So that tells us whether or not we met or exceeded the goal or not. The next step, really step 2, is deciphering those results. Now, the OFCCP tends toward assuming that missed goals equals insufficient effort, right? If your efforts were sufficient, you would have met your goals. But that's not really the way the real world works, and it puts the onus on the contractor, on you, to demonstrate otherwise. I like to kind of push back on that OFCCP assumption, and we'll talk about that a little more here in a minute, the distinction between effective and sufficient. But the good news is OFCCP also assumes that if the goal was met, the effort was, by definition, sufficient. And you know what? I'm going to roll with them on that one. Logically, I'm not sure that that's entirely true, but I'm going to go ahead and let them make that leap. If the goal was met or exceeded, then whatever it is we did, whether we did anything or not, must have been sufficient. Maybe it happened naturally. I don't know. The point is OFCCP is not going to dig in there. They're only looking at areas where we didn't meet the goal. And like I said, the assumption is that whatever you did must have been insufficient, and it's up to you to convince them otherwise. So the first question I like to ask is, were there sufficient placement opportunities? Right? We had a female placement goal of, let's say, 38%. We made 2 placements into the AAP job group, and they were both male. What can I tell from just 2 placements, or 1 placement, or no placements? Well, not much. In that particular situation, just 1 person would meet the goal. I'm not sure that's going to tell me anything about the effectiveness or the sufficiency of my affirmative action efforts when just 1 or 2 people, it's really kind of coming down to random chance, whether that's going to be a male or a female. I'm not sure I can really infer anything about that. So where there were, or there are expected to be, right, insufficient placement opportunities, I think it makes logical sense to simply keep the prior year plan in place. So assuming this is a recurring goal, a year-over-year goal, we had the same goal last year, but we didn't really place anybody into the job group. Well, now my job is easy. I just take that plan and I move it forward because we never really executed it. And to the extent that we did, we can't really evaluate whether or not it's worth doing again. We have to have some sort of information to go on. So where there were insufficient placement opportunities, that's an opportunity for me to copy and paste my action plan. And in an instance where that's not actually a bad thing to do. That might require, by the way, more than a 1-year look back next year, because the OFCCP is not actually stupid. I know sometimes we can kind of bash on the OFCCP from time to time, but these people are actually very good at what they do, and they're very knowledgeable. And when they see that there were only 1 or 2 placement opportunities last year, only 1 or 2 placement opportunities this year, and we keep kicking the can down the road, eventually they're going to say, yeah, but over the last 2-3 years, there are enough placement opportunities over that time frame for us to start drawing some conclusions. So keep that in mind. You can't kick the can down the road forever, but whether or not the extent to which there were even opportunities to meet the goal is important. And in planning and writing my action plan going forward, if I think that the company does not intend to do much hiring or do much promotion into a job group that has a goal, I can say that right in the action plan. right? So that may alleviate needing to really develop much of a plan unless and until that changes and we start actually placing people into the AAP job group that has a goal. Were there positive or negative changes in incumbency? Right? Positive here simply meaning that representation of the specific group has increased. Right? So for recurring goals, this could indicate that the prior year plan is working. Right? Without actually doing a goal attainment report, I'm just looking at the changes in incumbency from year to year. I take a look at my job group analysis at the beginning of my 2018 AAP, and female representation in the engineering job group was sitting at 16%. In 2019, it's all of a sudden sitting at 21%. Now the goal is 38%, but it looks like the needle's moving in the right direction. So maybe whatever it is we did in 2018 is working. It's not just working so much like gangbusters that it solved all of our problems in one 12-month period, but that's okay. It's not supposed to. In fact, it's a little suspicious if it does. So we have an indication that our plan was working. Maybe we pull that forward and we're pretty much done for that AAP job group, right? And if it's a new goal, this could rebut the OFCCP's assumption that a goal automatically means there's a problem, right? Incumbency is rising. We know that our incumbency is less than where we want it to be, but it's heading in the right direction. So in our identification of problem areas, maybe this goal isn't necessarily a problem that we need to have an action plan to address because the needle's already headed in the right direction. I would probably recommend making some effort there, but it's important to show OFCCP that you're looking at these things, you're looking at the trends, and that you're considering what they might actually mean. Because when you do it, it kind of forces them to do it as well. And don't forget about reorganizations, right? Changes in AAP or job group structure. That happens all the time. A lot of you are involved in very dynamic organizations that are constantly changing, reorganizing, acquiring, divesting, constant changes. And in that case, your prior year incumbency isn't going to do you a whole lot of good, right? We change the AAP structure from year to year, or we significantly change the job group structure, then our prior year incumbency and any trend that we may see is kind of meaningless because we're slicing and dicing things up a different way. But that can kind of give us a clean slate, right? We don't know if the prior year plan worked for those recurring year-over-year goals because now we're trying to view it in a new context. So it may make sense to just simply keep that perfectly good plan in place and see how it operates under the new regime, under the new organization. And that can kind of save you some time and resources by identifying areas where that would be appropriate and not having to go back and reinvent the wheel, right? I said I'm trying not to make your life harder. And that's one way that I think we can make it a little bit easier. Identify where we don't necessarily need to build up an action plan from scratch. Use what we have already in the can. Here's a good question. Should the placement goal be the only benchmark? Well, it is for OFCCP, I think. If the goal was met or exceeded, we assume that the efforts behind that were sufficient. But like I said, the inverse is not necessarily true. What about the incumbency percentage? We just talked about this. Female incumbency is 16%. The goal is 37%. But our placement rate, right? Our placement rate was 23%. The goal was not met, but the organization placed women into the AAP job group at a rate above current incumbency. Does that count for anything? So maybe we're seeing our incumbency creep up. Maybe we're not, but we're still placing women into the job group at a rate over where we started. Does that indicate that the needle is moving in the right direction, even if we're not 100% there yet? I think there's a strong argument that yes. That indicates that the needle is at least pointing in the right direction. So am I going to tear down my action plan, rebuild it from scratch, scrap everything that we've done? No, I'm not. In fact, I may just keep my old action plan in place and give it a little more baking time, give it a little more time to work, see where it goes. The purpose of targeted outreach and recruiting, by the way, is to increase the number of qualified applicants from the particular group in the pipeline, right? We talk about the pipeline all the time. It's a pipeline problem, right? We're trying to address the pipeline. The idea being that if we get more qualified candidates into the pipeline, that should lead to more of those candidates being selected because we're selecting the most qualified candidates. So if women aren't getting selected or people of color aren't getting selected, if we get more of those people who are better qualified into the pipeline, the more likely it is that they're going to be plucked out and given the job. So what can our applicant flow tell us? Did the percentage of all applicants for a particular group rise? That could be an indication that our efforts are working, right? Especially if our plan centered around outreach and recruiting efforts, the whole point of that was to get more qualified applicants in the pipeline. So if we see their representation in the pipeline rising, that may be an indication that what we're doing is working. So back off, OFCCP. Can we determine that for qualified applicants? And I hope the answer is yes there, right? Because we ought to be able to apply OFCCP's Internet Applicant Rule and at least screen our applicant flow for people who met the basic qualifications. And so we ought to be able to limit this little analysis at least to people who were basically qualified for the job and get some indication of whether or not qualified applicants of the particular group are rising or falling or staying static. And what does that tell us then about our efforts? We can potentially infer whether and to what extent current efforts are working by looking at the pipeline, right? So looking at incumbency, changes in incumbency, looking at placement rates in relation to incumbency, and looking at the actual pipeline and the applicant flow are all ways to look for progress. Why are we looking for progress? Well, if we can determine that progress is being made, there may not be so much need to do something different or something new. We cite the progress, right? We point to that progress, and the current plan may simply be to continue the prior year plan. It's a perfectly good plan. We put a lot of effort into that plan. It seems like it's working. Let's keep doing that. I'm going to make that argument to OFCCP by pointing to these things as sort of, and this is where the lawyer in me comes out, as supporting evidence, right? Countering the OFCCP's standard narrative that a missed goal necessarily means insufficient effort, I think is important, right? We've got to quit handing the OFCCP an automatic technical violation. They see a missed goal. They think, all right, here's a violation for insufficient outreach. And unless we can provide the narrative that convinces them otherwise, that's exactly what's going to happen. We have to demonstrate the degree to which our organization actively engages, right? Engages in good faith. Because, thank goodness, our compliance posture matters again. For those of you who endured being in compliance during the Pat Shue administration, when Patricia Shue was the director of the OFCCP under the Obama administration, then you know what I'm talking about. Your compliance posture, your compliance stance, all of a sudden didn't count for much. Their goal was to turn over every stone and find something, and if they didn't find something, they were going to turn over all the stones again. It was not a very productive period, I think, for either the OFCCP or for the federal contracting community. And now, under current director Craig Lean, the agency is once again recognizing that it's not about results. If we make it about results, we encourage people to violate Title VII. If we make it about meeting the goal, we encourage people to set quotas, right? It's about the effort, the quality of the effort, the amount of effort, whether or not the efforts are truly done in good faith. And frankly, the OFCCP is kind of impressed when they see thoughtful work because they don't often see it, right? It's really easy to forget that the OFCCP sees it all the works, all the things that are not going in our organizations because we're dedicated to this, we're involved in this, we're engaged in this. Not all organizations are. Not all organizations even realize they're federal contractors. And so in any given audit, OFCCP may be coming up against someone who doesn't even know what an AAP is, right? So when they see somebody who knows what this is about, gets it, and is really putting in good faith effort, then it stands out, right? It's surprising. And I think that's the goal, because it's meaningful again, to be able to show the OFCCP, yeah, it's a process. We want to get from here to there, and we're not there yet, but here's what we're doing to try to get there. And we think that that's pretty good. And that's what the OFCCP really ought to be evaluating, and they're starting to get back to that, which makes me really happy. But, Matt, we looked at all of this stuff, and the needle is pointing the other way, right? We're not seeing any progress. We're not able to point to some reason why we can just continue last year's plan. We need a new plan. We need to do something. No problem. All that information is still very useful. Don't overlook training as a good faith effort, right? That information about actual placement percentages and applicant flow and changes in incumbency can help us identify some key things, like who might be able to benefit from some additional training, right? Like I said, we're leaving IRAs for another discussion, so we don't have statistical evidence of potential discrimination. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about, in a certain area of the organization, availability is so far away from incumbency and nothing seems to move the needle. We seem to maybe have someone who is a little reluctant to hire or promote people that don't look and talk and act like them. Am I accusing them of discrimination? No. Could I identify them as someone who might be able to benefit from some additional training or some refresher training? Yeah, I might be. And this can be a good way to do it, right? Because we don't have all of the time and resources in the world. We can't constantly be pulling people off the floor, off of their regular jobs for training. So if we're going to focus that, this is one way to do it. And identifying what that additional training needs to contain. If we've done this exercise, if we've looked at these things where progress is either being made or where it's not, it can help us tailor that training to try to get the right message across and potentially identify processes that need to be maybe refined or enforced, right? Very often, we know we have a process in place and a policy for our recruiters to, on a timely basis, completely and accurately update our applicant disposition codes. And we know that that policy is constantly violated, right? So, you know, identifying what needs to be refined so that people are more likely to do what we're asking them to do, or is it an internal enforcement issue? We can identify those things. And if you haven't picked up on it already, our prior efforts don't necessarily need to be abandoned, right? So a company uses XYZ group for targeted outreach to female engineers. Female placements into our engineer group was not particularly impressive, and our applicant flow is not increasing. So let's consider reaching out to XYZ group to see if we can figure out why, right? Investigating in and of itself can be a good faith effort. We know we have this difference that we're trying to address. What we've tried to do doesn't seem to be moving the needle at all. So let's go through the critical process of trying to figure out why. Show OFCCP that we are engaged in good faith. It shows that we care, that we give a hoot, maybe even a hoot and a holler. And it creates a one-on-one relationship with our recruiting partner, which OFCCP loves. So that can be a good faith effort. And please, please, please don't overlook talent acquisition as a resource. Your recruiters know what works and what doesn't, right? They're the ones on the ground. They're the best resource for what's even out there to use. Right? It's easy for me in compliance to say, oh, well, let's see, I've got a goal for people of color in this AAP job group. So we will increase our targeted outreach and recruiting to people of color for those jobs. And then my talent acquisition professionals take one look at that and say, wait, what outreach and recruiting organizations that target people of color in those jobs? Do you know of any? I don't know of any. They're the ones who are kind of the best source for what's even out there, what's even possible. And it does me no good to commit the company to doing something that my recruiters already know we can't do. And that kind of brings us to the last point. They also know what's realistically doable. Just because it's out there, just because it's possible, doesn't mean that that's necessarily doable. And by and large, talent acquisition doesn't work for compliance. right? They don't report to compliance. So getting them to do extra work in their view can be kind of difficult. And kind of touching base with them to say, look, what's even doable here? Can really help tailor our action plans into something that might actually be implemented, might actually get something done. And they're a really great source for whether or not past efforts need to be abandoned to make room for new ones, right? They can tell you, is it really worth going to that job fair again? Are we really getting anything out of it? Maybe in a general sense, more than a specific AAP goal sense, but they can still give you that kind of sense. And they can also tell you, look, you're overloading me with things that you're requiring me to do when I have to fill a position in one of these job groups. So they're the ones that can tell you, we may need to turn off this switch so we can turn on the other one. In other words, the point being, we need our action plans to actually be actionable. And so if we don't have talent acquisition involved in the conversation, I think that's going to be kind of tricky. And we need to ask, is outreach and recruiting even the answer, right? It's the one that everyone jumps to. It's the knee-jerk reaction. But is that the right one? If you're unionized, for instance, are the jobs in question subject to a collective bargaining agreement? If so, your outreach is primarily going to need to be with the unions, right? It's not necessarily going out and working with external outreach partners. It's, look, the problem may be at the hiring hall. So is that outreach? Is that inreach? I'm not sure. Side reach? I'm not sure what that is. But your outreach may really need to reference the unions. And dealing with unions can be tricky. All right, there are just kind of no two ways about it. The law is really, really complicated. It can be a very emotional thing for people. If you don't have experience dealing with unions, get help if you need it. And it may not, frankly, be reasonable to expect the union to prioritize your AAP goals when they are sending someone over from the hiring hall, right? The key here is documentation. Be able to present the OFCCP with document evidence of you raising the issue with your union personnel, like, right, your union reps. And then let the OFCCP take on the union if they feel that's warranted. That's kind of what the Department of Labor is there for, is to help be a go-between between the employer and the unions for situations just like this. And if they feel it's warranted, they can go talk to the union. But as long as you have that sort of document evidence to show, we've identified a difference in demographics here that requires a goal. What can the company do about it? Well, there's a collective bargaining agreement involved. So I'm going to highlight that. And I'm not going to then necessarily engage in a bunch of outreach and recruiting that's only going to land people at the union hiring hall where the problem might be. And take a look at your factor weights, right? If your internal availability factors significantly into your availability calculation, strongly consider including inReach into your action plan, right? That's part of the process when we're developing our AAPs and we're calculating availability. We're determining, okay, there's outside availability, the people outside our organization that could be in here, and then there's our internal availability, the people that we're likely to promote up from within. And if we're saying that in this AAP job group, we primarily promote from within, then our action plan is primarily external outreach and recruiting, then there's a disconnect. So if internal availability factors heavily into your availability, your plan may focus exclusively on inReach. And yes, I made up the word inReach. If you Google or Bing that, I don't think you're going to find it unless it's finally taken off, in which case you can give me credit. Potential inReach ideas are maybe targeting female or people of color employees in the feeder groups that you've identified with notices of opportunities, right? It's a lot like targeted outreach and recruiting. We announce the job to everyone, but we give a special invitation to apply to certain protected groups. We can do the same thing internally, right? We can develop and implement training programs, the formation of or partnering with employee resource groups, things along those lines. But what about setting placement goals for feeder groups that don't otherwise have them? Yes, you can do that. Why would I do that? I actually see this quite a bit. We have a goal in job group 2A, which is primarily fed by our existing employees in job group 2B. Job group 2B has no placement goal. Okay, well, that's still the primary pipeline for job group 2A, and 2A has a goal. So 2B is the pipeline that we're trying to affect. So maybe I can set a placement goal for job group 2B. That would be a voluntary placement goal. It wouldn't be required, but that's my good faith effort to increase the number of qualified people of the particular group in the pipeline for job group 2A. So consider that as a possibility. OFCCP doesn't see people setting voluntary placement goals very often, and might be impressed when they do. So all of these things that I've talked about, if you've been taking furious notes and are going to be waiting for the slides to be delivered to you and stuff, because you weren't able to write as fast as I can speak, don't worry. You're also going to be provided with a BCGi Resources action-oriented program worksheet. Actually, 2 of them. There's one for female placement goals and one for people of color placement goals. And you can kind of see a little screenshot of it here. It's actually 2 pages. It asks you specific questions to look at the things that we covered. So basically, you can fill out the worksheet for every goal in every AAP job group that you've had and see all of this relevant information in one place, right? Get it all in one place, try to figure out what it is that it's telling us, what story all of the numbers and the trends and the stuff is trying to say, and use that to develop a better action plan. And then we can use the worksheet itself to show your work to the OFCCP. Yes, you can actually show them the worksheets that you used, whether it's this or something that you build, whatever it is. They want to see what went into the cake, right? What's in the recipe? How did you get from here to there? Why is the company doing or not doing what you're saying in the action plan? And this can be a really handy way, whether it's a formal worksheet or a spreadsheet or just notes that you keep in a Word document or something like that, whatever it is, if you document out the process and you can kind of show your work, show your thinking, pull all of that history from prior AAPs forward and show the process to OFCCP, then you're already having a conversation at the desk audit submission phase if you get audited. They get the AAP, they get your action plans, and they look and they see thoughtful, good faith effort work going on. And they're less interested on how effective that has been, right? Because they see that the company is engaged in good faith. You're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. And I think your audits are going to go a lot smoother. And by and large, your AAPs should be better to implement and manage. So that kind of takes us to my last slide, frankly. Why go to the extra effort? Well, the OFCCP is unimpressed with the same old generic boilerplate language. It signals to them, this organization is not engaged. This organization is not taking this seriously. This organization is going to rack up some violations, right? The standard response is not necessarily even the right response, right? Outreach may not be the answer. Changing my action plan from last year may not be the answer, right? So I've got to look at these things, put some thought into it, and maybe actually save myself and my recruiters some time and effort by not changing things up, not developing new things, not making people's life more difficult. Because frankly, talent acquisition is not looking for extra work to do. And every time I change the plan or add something to the plan, take something away, and give them more to do every time they post a job in one of my job groups with a placement goal, that just adds another layer to TA's annoyance, right? And look, the reality is what it is. We need other people to do things so that we can check boxes in our job. Those people don't necessarily work for us, and there are only so many fruit baskets I can afford to send to people to try to motivate them to do this. So I need to work with talent acquisition to come up with something that is actually doable, that they can actually execute in the hopes that they'll actually do it. And the whole point of all of this is so that this work is meaningful, right? So that we have a positive impact. Yes, I can download an AAP checklist and literally go through and check the boxes and then tell my bosses we are 100% compliant because I have checked all the boxes. But you and I know that that's not what this particular area of regulatory compliance is about. It's not about checking the boxes. Preparing an AAP is just the first step. It's the roadmap for what has to happen throughout the rest of the year that directs our affirmative action efforts with the hope of actually making the playing field more even. We make it more even so that people are judged on their merit, so that they are not shut out. The door isn't closed on them just because of the way that they were born or where they were born or what they look like. And they're more satisfied and they're happier at work and productivity goes up and revenue goes up and everybody's happy. But most of all, people are happy. We talk about work-life balance all the time. I don't know, I calculated the other day, I spend more waking hours at work with the people I work with than I do my wife. My work life, to a large extent, is my life. And if I'm miserable at work because I feel like I can't get ahead, I'm being held back because of the color of my skin, what I do or don't have between my legs. If I'm miserable at work, I'm miserable in life. And we have an opportunity to affect that, to even the playing field and let people succeed on or fail on their merits. And frankly, I think that's a good thing. So I'll get down off my soapbox on that. I'll let you know that if you have any direct questions or comments or just want to throw some heckling my way, here is my contact information. And the resources that we use to develop this comes out of a free online encyclopedia resource that is for anybody and everybody to use. I would encourage you to check it out at the URL there. Let me know what you think of it. And we're about 5 minutes away from when I was supposed to stop. So let's stop and see if anybody has any questions.
Matt, thank you so much. We actually haven't had any questions come in, but I would encourage everyone to use the contact information here to reach out to Matt. You're always welcome to reach out to AJE as well, and we can get something on to Matt if you have any questions on what you've heard today. So thank you, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate your time. As I mentioned, a brief survey coming up. If you'd like to tell us what you thought of today's presentation, that would be great. I'd like to say thank you again on behalf of America's Job Exchange to Biddle Consulting Group and to you, Matt, for today's presentation. Thanks to you all for attending. We hope to have you join us again in the future. This concludes our webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.